we will agree that was ideal opening presentation for this series. We now have this room until 9 o'clock, so we actually have 40 minutes, 35 minutes. And if you have any questions, and I hope you do, we'll take them now. I will try to hear them, and then I will relay them back to everyone so then everyone else can hear them, and then you'll have a chance to respond. Does that sound reasonable?
That's good.
So, there's the first question. Oh, and you're going to have a mic? No, I don't think we need a mic. We do need a mic?
Can you hear me like this?
Well...
Oh, okay, can you hear me? You can hear me like this.
Okay, go ahead.
This was quite fascinating, thank you. I wanted to just clarify and see if I missed my notes that I was taking on my smartphone. That the reasons for the past roughly 100 years for the increase in population, and maybe I took my notes wrong, so I'm hoping for clarification, is one, longer life expectancy and lower infant mortality rate. Are those accurate? And if there's other ones, I'd like to understand that a little bit more. And then I have a second part of my question after I understand why the population explosion over the past 100 years.
So the question is, what are the primary mechanisms for the increase in population in the last 100 years?
Yeah, the standard model that we have is called the demographic transition. And the demographic transition model is basically that humans used to have very high birth rates and very high death rates. The death rates were unfortunate, of course, we couldn't control them, and very variable. So we would have periodic times of famines, and we would have wars, we would have various epidemics. The birth rates had to be high in order to maintain this population, and in normal times had to be higher than death rates because we would have these epidemics and wars and famines. What happened was that death rates came down and birth rates stayed high for a while. They didn't adjust immediately. And that period when the death rates came down and the fertility rates remained high was basically the time of the population explosion. So the death rates coming down were an important and probably initial driving factor in the big increase in population.
Thank you. So did you have a second part to that?
And the second, so then after 2050, the largest contributing factor to a population stagnation, I guess, is simply lower birth rates. It's below the 1-to-1 ratio. That's the largest contributing factor?
Yes.
Thank you.
Question here at the front.
Thank you. From what you said tonight, it seems that China has the wrong policy. If they'd wanted to limit their population, they should have focused on the women only and allowed them to limit their birth to one girl child per family. Is that so?
Well, many people argue that China had the wrong policy to begin with. The view that most people have is that China's no fertility was due to its one-child family policy, but actually fertility came down came down before the one-child family policy was instituted, and didn't come down much during that policy. It would have been interesting to have, instead of a one-child policy, to have a kind of one-daughter policy. It's hard to enforce, right? Because you need boys and girls. So, but China could have had a different policy, which is a two-child family policy to begin with, and just mandate that people start having their children at a later age. What happened with the Chinese family planning policy is, since they decided that people would only have one child, people had their one child very early. And if you said, okay, you could have two children, but you couldn't have your first child until age 30, they would have had about the same population as they have now with a 2-child family policy instead of a 1-child family policy.
Hi, that kind of leads into what I was going to ask is the reproductive technology. A lot of people are having more children later, multiple births, and taking that into account. And I just recently read about the potential of cloning a Neanderthal. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
I don't think cloning of Neanderthals will help us much. I think we have more serious problems to deal with. What is interesting is that there's been this trend for women to have children later and later in life, and that has artificially depressed the birth rates that you usually read about in newspapers. So you have to be very careful. Demographers know this, but journalists have never figured it out. And so when you look at countries that have sometimes very extremely low birth rates, it's not actually because women are going to have that few children over their lifetime, but there's a transition from having children earlier in life to later in life. And that makes the birth rates become artificially low for a while, and then they bounce back up. So I showed you the picture for Canada, the birth rates. And of course, you haven't memorized them. But if you look hard at that graph, you would have seen that the fertility rates of Canadians went down and now has come up a little bit. The interpretation of that shouldn't be, the Canadians are having more babies now. It really is basically an issue having to do with the timing of fertility within the life cycle. So you have to be careful when you look at birth rates to understand that some of what you see has to do with timing as well as numbers of children.
Joan, you can just say it and I can repeat it. So can I just repeat, is educating women, was it a major factor for declining birth rates in Indonesia specifically?
I think the answer is certainly yes. All over the world, educating women is one of the most powerful ways to get fertility down. But there's a very important caveat here, which is that when you educate women and you educate men, they have fewer children, but they're also more productive. And there is this wonderful study done at the National Center for Aeronautics, NCAR, in Boulder, Colorado, that actually looked at the effects of education on pollution. Right? And there are two effects here. One is that more educated women have fewer children and more educated women are richer. And the two go in opposite directions, right? So you might want to say, I want to lower fertility in order to decrease pollution, therefore I'm going to educate women. Now, educating women will reduce fertility, but it will also make them richer, which is what we want, actually. But this effect on pollution is going to be offset because those two go in opposite directions.
I noticed you didn't talk about a material restraint or a challenge in terms of material restraints, so things like metals and petrochemicals. So could you talk about that, like things other than agricultural resources?
Did everybody get that? So, are there other constraints besides farmland that might play into this?
You know the famous Ehrlich-Simon bet. That bet was Julian Simon, who wrote the book called The Ultimate Resource, bet anybody that the price of raw materials, the bet was you name any 6 raw materials you want, and let's look at the real price of that 10 years later. And if the price goes down, then you pay me the difference. If the price goes up, then I'll pay you the difference. Well, Paul Ehrlich took that bet, and he lost, and he sent Julian Simon a check. Now, if the same bet were made in the last 10 years, Paul Ehrlich would have won. Now, the question is sort of what is the real long-run trend in the scarcity of resources? And in order to look at that, you actually want to look at the long-run trend in the price of resources. That's how we figure out what's scarce and what's not scarce. And that's not clear what that trend is for a whole bunch of different resources. And so it's not clear that that's going to be a problem or it's not going to be a problem. And so I avoided it because of that ambiguity. The more difficult issue, the economists think about these things in 2 different ways. They think about those resources where markets function well and their prices, and resources where markets don't function well and there aren't prices. For the most part, economists argue that in the markets where there are prices, the standard market mechanisms will work. There will be substitution, there will be added incentives for invention when the prices go up. And there's some evidence, of course, for this. But in markets and in areas where there are no prices or the prices are really highly distorted, you have problems. And I think this, for me, these are the areas that you have to worry about. This is CO2 in the atmosphere. This is biodiversity. This sometimes is water, where there are sometimes prices and sometimes not prices. And when you have resources that are not priced, where markets don't function very well, you have to worry about how to deal with those, because you could get yourself into situations like we're in with our atmosphere. We have one atmosphere. We're running a chemistry experiment in our atmosphere. It would be nice if we had another atmosphere in case the chemistry experiment went wrong. But we don't have another one, and there are no mechanisms, there are no prices, right? So I think for the resources that have functioning markets, reasonable prices, future markets, people doing the anticipation, people getting rewards for innovating when prices are high, I don't worry so much about those. Okay? It's the other ones that bother me a lot.
Hi. Thank you so much for that talk. I feel terrible taking us back to the earlier comment. I just had a question around education. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on whether education makes a woman smarter, or does it just make someone more productive, busy, and too busy to have children, and maybe delay childbirth and reduce fertility that way?
So I think that was a clear question. So what is it about educating women that leads them to have fewer children? Do we know?
Let me say something about the first part of the question. Does educating women make them smarter?
I avoided that part of the question.
Yes. My grandmother, many years ago, would produce meals with fresh fish. The fish swam for a little while in our bathtubs. There are lots of people who knew how to make beer in various ways. If you ask yourself about the sort of inventiveness of supposedly uneducated women, what they could do, they did an enormous variety of absolutely amazing things, right? Schooling doesn't make people smart, right? So, but on the other hand, what schooling does is provides a whole bunch of different things to women. It provides, in part, some knowledge about how to control their fertility. It provides a different mindset. If you're in a world in which you think you have no control, and and you're asked how many children do you want, this was commonly asked in old surveys. And the very common response was laughter. What do you mean, how many children do I want? What kind of question is that? I'm going to have as many children as God gives me. Right? Now, one thing that education does is it changes the mentality of people from one which is more passive to one where people say, I could control my environment, and part of what you can do is control the number of children that you could have. But it also provides women with a whole bunch of alternative things that they could do with their life that are important. But I think an example which I like is I've done some historical work on fertility of American women around the 1880s. Now, this was a time in which women were very educated, relatively educated, really. I was looking at them in New England, so they were relatively educated women. And the married women almost never worked outside the home. Right? And so you had a situation in which women could read and write and went to school, but they had no outside occupations. And the question is, did the reading and the writing result in them having fewer children, even though they were not going out to work? They didn't have this competitive use of their time. And it turned out that it did, that reading and writing led to fewer children, even though these women were not going out and getting jobs. So education, in part of adults, makes them want to produce educated children, and educated children are more costly. And that's a very important reason why education brings down fertility.
So here, and then here, and then there. Yep, go ahead.
I'm wondering how you see an end to these population explosions in some countries or regions like the Sahel. Is it going to be sort of a good ending where women do become educated, where family sizes gradually go down, or are they simply going to run out of food in the regional populace? They're probably there right now in Niger. I was there in May. They cannot feed themselves. They have to have rice from Pakistan and corn oil from the States, and, or they can't eat. And there's more and more of them every year.
So the question is, can you forecast sort of how these countries with these population explosions are going to fare?
I wish I could. Let me tell you just a little story about Niger. One of the best computer models that I'd ever seen in my life was done by a graduate student, and it had to do with Niger. And it was done in the 1970s, and it was paid for originally by USAID. And the conclusion of that was that there was no short-term fix. That the only things you could possibly think about doing are long-run, difficult policies. This was highly disliked by the people who paid for the report, who wanted to know what the quick fix was. Well, he turned out to be totally right. There was no quick fix. And I don't see any quick fix either now in Niger. And I don't know, I don't see a living happily ever after scenario for them. Now, maybe there will be a living happily ever after scenario for them, but it's difficult to see right now. It looks difficult and possibly sad in terms of how it's going to end.
Can I just clarify? Did you say that the problem had been identified in the 1970s for Niger? Did you say that?
The problem that we now see for Niger has been known for at least 4 decades.
Okay, I think that's probably an important.
That is that the policymakers have known about this, have thought about it, and we remain in the same mess that we were 4 decades ago. And I wish I could say that we are on the path now of enlightenment and good, something which in the next 30 years or 40 years would get us to some desirable state. But as you said, that doesn't look like that's in the cards now.
Yeah.
So education, health, and income seem almost necessarily highly correlated. How much do we know about the relative effects of each of those 3 in decreasing fertility, and how useful is it to disentangle them? Or are they necessarily always going to go together?
That's a lovely question. They don't go together now. And as a matter of fact, I like the story which compares Moldova and Nigeria. Now, Moldova is as I told you, one of the countries that's shrinking the fastest. It has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. Nigeria has one of the highest fertility rates in the world, and they both have the same incomes. The difference between Nigeria and Moldova is the Moldovans are much more educated. And one thing which really brings fertility down quite a bit is if you have an educated poor population. Okay? And Moldovans are educated and poor. And so income, like in the case of Nigeria, which is the same as Moldova, is not what's driving what's going on. Okay? It's really the relationship between income and education, which is crucial. So when you have countries with high education and low income, they have very, very low fertility. And so Moldova, which is a very poor country, the poorest country in Europe, has much lower fertility than richer countries. So there are a lot of richer countries that have more children than the poorer countries of Europe.
Thank you. It's over here. There's a question.
Hi, yes. Your talk has given us some really clear insight into some significant global problems tonight. And I'm wondering if governments in setting policy have the same kind of access or insight from demographers. And maybe another way to put it, are demographers unemployed or under-consulted in governments forming policy?
Any demographers in the audience? They're looking.
Under-consulted is certainly true. But I must say that even worse, when you talk to government officials, pretty much they know the outlines of the story that I told you today. However, if you talk to journalists, they don't. So today I got an email from somebody from NPR, National Public Radio in the United States in Los Angeles. And he just picked up an article in which I was mentioned in a website called Slate, which said the world's population may not be exploding quite at the rate that you thought it was, and it may actually go down. Now, we published the article called The End of World Population Growth in 2001 in Nature, right? 10 years ago, right? So the journalist somehow has sort of picked this up 10 years later. Oh, it may not be going, it may not be going up so fast. And in the email, he said, also, could you give me the name of somebody who thinks just the opposite? And I thought, well, nobody seriously thinks just the opposite. I gave you the UN forecast and our forecast, and basically they're about the same, right? And so you wonder where their minds are and what they've been reading and what they've been smoking. And I think, that part of what goes on is they don't explain to people that the world's population growth is essentially going to come to an end. The world is not having an explosion of population. Population growth rates have been slowing for over half a century and probably will get up to a point pretty soon where it's zero. And to say sort of, wow, this is sort of extremely new idea, you only published it 10 years ago, and tell me the people who are going to who are going to dispute this idea, means simply that they're not paying attention. And when they don't pay attention, the politicians don't pay attention either. The politicians, their staff members don't understand this, and you can't get reasonable policy. So I think it's a real problem that we have to have talks like this, where people can understand what the true demographic situation is, so that ultimately we could have reasonable policies. Because if people don't understand these things, then they go off and do things which are not very efficacious.
The question here, and then a question up at the back. So, go ahead, sir.
All this talk about poor people, what about controlling the rich people so that they don't pollute so much, like large corporation, and they seem to misinform people also, which causes a lot of problems. So is that something that the UN is looking into?
Did everybody hear that? So if we're not dealing with the population growth, but we're dealing with things like the effects of the current population, is the UN looking into policies that are directed towards the more developed countries rather than the less developed countries?
And they're basically, in the richer countries, there's a lot of money being spent on getting people to have more children. And I don't think this is a corporate issue. I think people feel very strongly that if my ethnic group, if my country group is declining, it must be because of something bad. It's sort of built into our mentality that we have population shrinkage when we have wars, when we have epidemics, when we have failures, famines. But perhaps we need a new mindset for the new world, in which perhaps after 2075 or so, the world's population shrinks, maybe we ought to say that's not such a bad thing. Let's manage this shrinkage in a way where we can all live with it. We could all still have increases in our standards of living while the Earth's population is shrinking. But I don't see corporations having a big role in this one way or the other. But the problems of the rich countries are things that we need to talk about, which people forget. They often say, we have a population problem because we have population explosions, and we put the onus of our problems on the poorest people in the world. Most of our problems with our environment are not due to the poorest people in the world, they're due to the richest people in the world. And we have to engage these richest people, that's us, in the dialogue that has to do with consumption, which has to do with all sorts of issues having to do with pollution. When we need to design policies that are going to get us to this time of population plateau, the major policies are policies which address people in the richer countries.
So the question up here.
Yeah, that was kind of addressing my point, which consumerism and the idea of ever-expanding consumerism as a policy, world policy. It seems to me that when you're going to talk about population, how do you factor in the fact that there are less people consuming more? An example being China, and actually having a lot of pressure on the goods that we will now need on an average. So I'm just wondering how you factor that part in.
So again, the question is, how do you factor in the use, which is the second part of this, getting to the transition, the way that we use our resources per capita, not just the total number of people. So do you have a short comment on that? Or?
I actually don't have a short comment on that, but the issue, a very important issue, is how we spend our money. And the way that we spend our money is directed by prices that we see. Now, what we do in the richer countries is we happily pollute the environment, the atmosphere, by putting CO2 in the atmosphere because we don't pay the full cost to the environment of doing that. Now, when we buy palm oil from Indonesia and the palm oil plantations are expanding at the cost of the habitat of the orangutans, there's also a cost to that which we don't pay. And so our consumption is directed, and this is our standard economic system, by a set of prices by which we judge relative scarcities and values of things. And we have to address environmental problems by pricing them into everyday decisions. When we get price signals which say it's expensive and costly to pollute the environment, then people will choose to do things differently. So there are two ways we can deal with these things. We can ask people to be good, and it's always nice, and people will often, you just say, you should be good, and you should be good, better for the planet and better stewards, and people will react to that. But people will also react to the prices of what they consume. And when we give them the wrong signals, they're going to do the wrong things. So it seems to me that consumerism per se is not a bad thing. We like actually people to consume things, but we want them to consume things which don't hurt the environment. And we have to provide them with signals which tell them that these kind of activities are very harmful, don't do it.
Are there any other pressing questions? Well,
If we have a moment, I could end on a story.
would you like to hear a story? That's what happens when you're illustrious. Please.
The story is what I call the story of the forecaster's dilemma. And it goes like this. A king wants to know how his kingdom is going to look like in the future. So he goes to a convention of forecasters. And the king gives them a proposition. You forecast how my kingdom is going to look in the future, and if you're right, I will make you rich beyond belief. But if you're wrong, I'll kill you. So he thought there would be some forecasters who were sure enough about their forecasts to take him up on this, but there were none. Now, he had a personal relationship with a very wise forecaster, and one day when she came to visit him, he asked her why no forecaster would take up this challenge. And she said, it's simple. They all know that they would die, because if they told you that things would go well, then you wouldn't make the needed reforms and things would go badly. If they told you they would go badly, then you would make the reforms and they would go well, and either way they would die. So remember, when you look at forecasts, that those forecasts assume that you will be very active even if they tell you everything will be fine.
Well, on that note, I think we should thank Professor Sanderson again for an amazing presentation.